So, good afternoon readers, it's Tilly here from Tilly's Shelf and welcome to another afternoon of discussing Victorian poetry. So we missed a day yesterday because I was chatting on Zoom to Ros from Scallydandling About the Books. We were doing another one of our discussing drama videos, which we do one of every month, and we were talking about Oscar Wilde's An Ideal Husband in honour of Victober, of course. So you can find that video over on Ros's channel. I will try to link it below, if not immediately, then once I have full technical capabilities restored, once my laptop is no longer in multiple pieces. And yeah, hope you find that one interesting. So the last couple of poets we have done have had a connection to the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, and that continues today because the poet in between, James Thompson, he only had a really long poem that sounded, to be honest, fairly dull. What was it called? Oh, I don't know. It's got quite a nice name, The City of Dreadful Night, but I didn't want to read like 20 pages of poems. The poem that I'm going to read today is also quite a long one. It's probably the longest I would be willing to read aloud, and I'm sorry if I struggle as I read it, but I did want to read you a poem by William Morris because he is such a Victorian character, and obviously so centrally linked to the pre-Raphaelites and to the arts and crafts movement that he was kind of at the forefront of promoting, that I felt like it would be unfair to leave him out. So I picked the shortest poem by William Morris that I have in this book. If you want to know more about William Morris, I would highly recommend a video that's been made by Kate Howe, where she talks about the arts and crafts movement and shows some amazing cross stitch that she's been doing, and again I will link that below as and when I'm able to do so. Yeah, so the poem I'm going to read is Iceland First Scene, and it's from a slightly later stage in William Morris's life and work. It's in the 1890s, and he first went to Iceland in 1871, so it's interesting that this poem was apparently written so long after that first vision of the country. But going to Iceland was kind of a turning point in William Morris's life, where he moved away significantly from the more pre-Raphaelite movement, which is really quite obsessed with chivalry and Arthurian legend and those kinds of ideals, and progressed more towards having a broader medievalist interest in covering the Norse mythology as well, and he went on to be one of the first people to translate various sagas and make them accessible to an English audience. For instance, the saga of the Volsungs, which I read this year for Sagalong, so nice little inter-read-along connection there. So I'm going to go ahead and read Iceland First Scene, and I think it is going to take me longer to read it, so there might be less discussion in this one. So yeah, a text from 1891. Lo, from our loitering ship, a new land at last to be seen. Toothed rocks down the sides of the frith, on the east guard a wide weary lee, and black slope the hillsides above, stripped adown with their desolate green, and a peak rises up on the west from the meeting of cloud and of sea, foursquare from base unto point, like the building of gods that have been. The last of that waste of the mountains, all cloud-wreathed and snow-flecked and grey, and bright with the dawn that began just now at the ending of day. Ah, what we came forth for to see, that our hearts are so hot with desire. Is it enough for our rest, the sight of this desolate strand, and the mountain waste voiceless as death, but for the winds that may sleep not nor tire? Why do we long to wend forth through the length and breadth of a land dreadful with grinding of ice and record of scarce hidden fire, but that there, midst the grey grassy dales, sore scarred by the ruining streams, lives the tale of the Northland of old and the undying glory of dreams? O land, as some cave by the sea where the treasures of old have been laid, the sword it may be of a king whose name was the turning of fight, or the staff of some wise of the world that many things made and unmade, or the ring of a woman, maybe, whose woe is grown wealth and delight. No wheat and no wine grows above it, no orchard for blossom and shade. The few ships that sail by its blackness but deem it the mouth of a grave, yet sure when the world shall awaken, this too shall be mighty to save. Or rather, O land, if a marvel it seemeth that men ever sought thy wastes for a field, and a garden fulfilled of all wonder and doubt, and feasted amidst of the winter when the fight of the year had been fought, whose plunder all gathered together was little to babble about, cry aloud from thy wastes, O thou land, not for this, Not for this nor for that was I wrought, amid waning of realms and of riches and death of things worshipped and sure. I abide here the spouse of a god, and I made, and I make, and endure. O queen of the grief without knowledge, of the courage that may not avail, of the longing that may not attain, of the love that shall never forget, more joy than the gladness of laughter thy voice hath amidst of its wail, more hope than of pleasure fulfilled, amidst thy blindness is set, more glorious than more glorious than gaining of all thine unfaltering hand that shall fail. For what is the mark on thy brow but the brand that Brynhild doth bear, loved once and loved and undone by a love that no ages outwear? Ah, when thy Balder comes back and bears from the heart of the sun peace and healing of pain and the wisdom that waiteth no more, and the lilies are laid on thy brow mid the crown of the deeds thou hast done, and the roses spring up by thy feet that the rocks of the wilderness wore. Ah, when thy Balder comes back and we gather the gains he hath won, shall we not linger a little to talk of thy sweetness of old? Yea, turn back a while to thy travail, whence the gods stood aloof to behold. And that is the end. So I really love how rich the description is in this poem, and how vivid and how much he seeks to kind of invoke not just the one myth, but the many layers of myth that go into his idea of Iceland. And it's clear that he's somebody that has an intense enthusiasm for mythology and history and just all of those layers of stories that you get digging into the history of Iceland. And you can almost trace that sense of somebody who has been just so excited by the discovery of how much there is to learn about Iceland's history, and the extent of the sagas, presumably as somebody who has been so keen on Arthurian legend, which is to a certain extent quite limited. It goes back a long time, but a lot of Arthurian legends come from similar places and consist of similar stories and similar themes. So you get the feeling that he might almost feel like he's exhausted that repertoire of mythology, and he's so gleeful that he's delving into this whole new landscape. And it's interesting how much he talks about that landscape in relation to the mythology, and how barren and unwelcoming the land is kind of a recurring theme of this poem, of how you might almost dismiss it in a sense if you didn't know the wealth of literature that could be found there. So this idea of being so excited to see the land at last, and then describing it consistently in terms of black and grey. So black slopes the hillside above, the waste of the mountains is cloud wreathed and snowflecked and grey, the grey grassy dales, and just this repeated idea of desolation. I thought desolation was actually repeated, but I think potentially it isn't. But yeah, again, ships sail by its blackness, and just this repeated idea of it being a really hostile and unwelcoming place, and yet underneath that, he just seems to be so excited by the fact that underneath that is hidden all of these stories of treasure and gold and wonders. It's interesting, the notes on this poem kind of reveal a little bit of almost inaccuracy in his enthusiasm. So he talks about kings and queens, which is a very kind of more of a Southern European notion, when at the time Iceland was a republic, and it would have been more accurate to talk about they had leader figures, but they didn't necessarily have the kind of crowned queens that we might talk about. Although there is the implication that the queen in question is the island of Iceland itself. Just the idea that he's imbuing the island itself with so much character, calling it a queen, and giving it almost a point of view in this poem, and seeking to himself be taken back to that time, and feeling like he should be there when, he mentions this character of Balder, who is, according to the notes, a Norse god of the sunlight, who after his murder was bound in hell forever. His return was something to be hoped for, but impossible. His tale was well known in Victorian England and was associated with the cycle of the seasons and the coming of spring. This sense that he hopes to be there when Balder returns, like he wants to become a part of that mythological history, and he just really wants to involve himself really deeply in that. I feel like William Morris is a character who goes at everything with enthusiasm and dedication. He's not a man who really like does things by halves. So he decides he wants to go to Iceland, and he decides he wants to get interested in sagas. So it's not just casually reading a saga every now and then. It's really like wanting to know the whole of the work and wanting to translate it and wanting to live it as well. You really get that sense of enthusiasm from this poetry, but also a sense of like he's almost questioning it, and he's almost thinking like, why are we so interested by this place? Why are people drawn to this place? What came we forth for to see that our hearts are so hot with desire? And then just this question of like, why did people go and live there? Why did people want to celebrate their lives there when they their plunder all gathered together was little to babble about? Like, they couldn't have made a very successful living in this place, although that contrasts with what you see in the sagas, where there's often like really quite lavish descriptions of feasts and so on, but like there's no wheat or wine, he mentions. There's this landscape that's really very challenging to live in, and it's almost like he's valuing the hardship of that life above the wheat and wine chivalry, Arthurian legend style lifestyle in southern areas of like in France and Britain, and like he's deifying the difficulty of life that the writers of the sagas experienced. So yeah, I think it's a great poem. It's actually, I know I stumbled a few times, but it's not a bad poem to read aloud, despite its length and the length of the lines. In some ways that helps because they kind of create more complete phrases, even though it's I would say relatively inaccessible language. Like, you have to maybe think about it a little bit to catch his drift slightly. Or I know I did, maybe I'm just a bit dim, but I felt like I needed to kind of think about what he meant with each phrase a little bit more. But the way that the longer lines are paced, you kind of like get you get a bit of momentum going through the line. And build up towards quite a regular and predictable rhyme pattern, and that made it quite easy for me to read aloud, so I thought that was an interesting feature of his work, and I guess potentially influenced by the fact that he was thinking about saga poetry and how that would often be like a spoken form of poetry that had to be memorable and easy to recite. It says in this book that the longer lines are more in tribute to another poet called Swinburne, who is later on in this book, who was a friend of his, but I'd like to think that there's kind of like a blended approach there, particularly if he by this time has got experience of writing his own versions and translating and responding to the sagas. So anyway, let me know what you think of that William Morris poem. Let me know what you think of William Morris himself, and you know, his art and personality and involvement with the Pre-Raphaelites. They were just such an interesting group, I think. Just like the little interrelationships between them and the things that they set out to do, and the influence that quite a small number of people had on the Victorian times, but also notably on our vision of the Victorian times, like over 100 years into the future. We still look back and see those Pre-Raphaelite designs and like the William Morris wallpapers and stuff as quintessentially very, very Victorian, even though at the time styles would have ebbed and flowed and they wouldn't have been maybe a very widespread design. You just look at it and you think, Victorian, this kind of classic Victorian image. So yeah, interested to hear what you think of that and what you thought of this poem. I hope you enjoyed it. Tomorrow, speaking about things that are quintessentially Victorian, we have got another poet laureate, but not one of the best poet laureates, I don't think, of the Victorian era. So we've got a poem by Alfred Austin. So I hope you are looking forward to that. I am interested to read it now, and I will speak to you soon. Thank you for watching.